I want to begin by paying tribute to the Lenape tribe from whose ancestral grounds I am presenting. The title of my talk is An Open Opportunity, Free Software, Community-Supported Infrastructure, and the People's University. Next slide, please. I want to thank Ursula and the organizers of these workshops for inviting me here today, and to all of you for coming. And I'd like to take a moment to thank the amazing set of CUNY colleagues with whom I have worked to create, share, support, and foster open source technology, open educational resources, and open infrastructure across our university. Next slide, please. If you could go to the next slide, please. Actually, you can go 2 ahead, please. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, wait, sorry. Okay, yes. So on 8:43 p.m. on August 24th, 2020, 5 months into the worldwide COVID-19 pandemic, Ian Linkletter, a learning technology specialist at the University of British Columbia, tweeted a link to an unlisted but publicly accessible YouTube video published by Proctorio, a company that sells exam proctoring software. Links to the videos have been shared by Proctorio itself on a website that provided support to instructors using the platform. And actually, I apologize, Ursula, can you go back 2 slides? Okay, one forward, I apologize, thank you. Linkletter's university, University of British Columbia, was using Proctorio, and Linkletter had grown angry that his university had spent money on software that was being used to surveil students while they took exams. In his tweets, he pointed out the dangers he saw in the software. He wrote, these are videos from Proctorio's instructor help. I think it's important for us in our communities to know how the software functions so we can criticize it. I will keep sharing information, okay? He also wrote this video from, and he's again linking to publicly accessible but unlisted YouTube videos. And he says, this video from Proctorio's YouTube channel shows how the abnormal eye movement function works. This is the one that will show you beyond a doubt the emotional harm you are doing to students by using this technology. And then he later wrote, this video from Proctorio's YouTube channel shows how the abnormal head movement function works. This is the one that will identify students with medical conditions that affect their head movement. They will get a higher suspicion level for it. Soon after Linkletter published these tweets, the YouTube videos to which he referred began to disappear from YouTube. He continued to criticize Proctorio in his tweets, arguing that, quote, Proctorio can't hide, we know their CEO, we know he's unethical, we know how the software works, we know it's the worst. And for anyone who hasn't explored this type of exam surveillance software, it's basically sold to universities so that faculty members can track and look for signs of quote unquote cheating. And these types of software do this by analyzing, by basically surveilling students through video and watching for abnormal movements. A few weeks later, after Linkletter published these tweets, he was informed that Proctorio was suing him for copyright infringement, claiming that by linking to its own YouTube videos, he had distributed confidential material owned by the company. Next slide, please. Needless to say, lawsuits are expensive. And as an educational technologist working at a university, Linkletter had few means to defend himself. He quickly depleted his entire savings and turned to the larger community of educational technologists to help him out. To date, he has raised over $85,000 Canadian to help him in his legal costs. Following months of legal delays, just last week on June 14th, the Supreme Court of British Columbia rendered judgment on Proctorio's lawsuit and thankfully denied it. But this was clearly an example of a well-funded company attempting to intimidate an educational technologist, one that many would not have had the ability or the strength to resist. Next slide, please. Or if you go one back, sorry, thank you. Thank you. So Proctorio's legal assault on an educational technologist who dared raise concerns over unethical practices, that, to be honest, are present in most test proctoring software, should give us all concern. The spectacle of a large company suing an individual educational technologist for his critical tweets highlights so much of what is wrong about educational technology in the academy today. And among the obvious problems, next slide, please. EdTech is big business. Universities, including my own CUNY, spend millions of dollars on enterprise software solutions such as Blackboard, Turnitin, Microsoft 365, and Respondus, and even including the platform on which we're meeting today. Romanced by vendors who preach a gospel of technological solutionism, universities increasingly turn to corporations to run the infrastructure of their academic operations, including email and learning management systems. The reasons preferred or offered for these investments involve economies of scale, better systems of support, and increased uniformity in the student experience. But the overall result is that many aspects of the faculty and student experience in the modern academy have been outsourced to private companies. Next slide, please. For-profit companies have one goal in mind: shareholder profit. Business is business, and it shouldn't surprise anyone that companies keep the long goal in mind, and that goal is including shareholder revenue. And we see what happens when well-meaning people like Ian Linklater get in the way of that shareholder profit. Next slide, please. Corporate ed tech is built on a surveillance model. Sometimes the software is literally surveilling students, as in the case of exam proctoring software. But at other times, student content submitted through platforms like Turnitin, which is a plagiarism detection service, is quite literally disenfranchised and monetized. Student writing, student content is quite literally disenfranchised and monetized by the corporation. In other cases, collective and depersonalized aggregated user information is used by companies to improve their own platforms, all with the aim of increasing engagement. Next slide, please. In her book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power, Shoshana Zuboff defines surveillance capitalism as a process that unilaterally claims human experience as free raw material for translation into behavioral data, unquote. Zuboff describes this as a process of extraction. Platforms such as Google, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, quote, lure users into their extractive operations in which personal experiences are scraped and packaged as a means to others' ends, unquote. Zuboff argues that personalization is a crucial aspect of this mining operation. The platform shapes itself to our behaviors, but it also shapes our behaviors, encouraging more extraction. As the scholar Eben Moglen has argued, quote, we built media that consumed us as we consumed it, unquote. The smooth interfaces of these platforms are precisely calibrated to make us want to return again and again in an unceasing cycle of attention and personalization, a process in which we give our information freely to these systems, which churn them back towards us in a new form of targeted control, or as Moglen would call it, spying. Next slide, please. So this is the particular landscape of EdTech that I want to talk about today. And I want to talk about it not just in terms of the concerns we should have, but also the means of resistance we can form. And I want to suggest this as a central project, not the central project maybe, but a central project for DHers interested in critical infrastructure studies, especially considering how much our universities spend on software produced by for-profit companies, including learning management systems and others, as I described earlier. Because sadly, the university as a space, as we know, is enmeshed fully in corporate capitalism. There is no outside of capital in the modern university. Indeed, capital is enmeshed in almost every aspect of modern university life, from the systems we use to register students, to verifying attendance, to those on which the platforms we use to teach our classes, to our email systems. And of course, COVID has magnified this 1,000-fold. As vendors jumped at the opportunity. According to a recent article in the Conversation, American education startup companies raised $2 billion in 2020, 30% more than in 2019. And these corporations generally see this as a branding opportunity. As the 2019 Spark Landscape Analysis pointed out, corporate academic publishers like Elsevier, Springer, Wiley, Clarivate, Pearson, McGraw-Hill, and Cengage are rapidly reconfiguring themselves as data analytics companies, offering a seamless provision of services that cater to multiple layers of the research and teaching process, and that promise field-level data to universities in an attempt to influence institutional decision-making. Seen from this angle, students and even faculty begin to look more and more besieged by the commercial aims of proprietary ed tech, by the reach of corporate educational technology capital. Next slide, please. And yet, and this is going to have to be necessarily brief, but I do want to say that at my university, the 25 campus City University of New York and others, there is resistance to the work of surveillance capital. And this is the work that I think those of us in DH and critical infrastructure studies should pay attention to, celebrate, foster, and expand. Here at CUNY, at the City University of New York, there are other models of ed tech, ones built on community values that do not embed the profit imperative at the heart of everything they do. These examples of community-owned infrastructure point to significant opportunities for those of us who want to answer Alan Liu's call in his draft book In Progress Against the Cultural Singularity to make the work of critical infrastructure studies and infrastructure building the work of DH, when he writes, and we heard him earlier, in short, can the considerable existing intelligence, idealism, and moral force of the digital humanities be redirected from being only an instrument of institution work to becoming, through interventions in instrumental infrastructure, also a way to act on institutions and their wider social impact? So I'm going to move quickly through the next slides given the time constraints, but just to show you some examples of resistance in progress. Next slide, please. At the City University of New York, we saw our university moving forward with contracts for Respondus, which is a surveillance proctoring software, and also Turnitin. And my colleagues, Roxanne Shirazi, led the creation of a petition, along with my colleagues Luke Walter and Lisa Rohde, a petition against, next slide please, against this software, which resulted in testimony, a student a petition as well, and then next slide please, ultimately testimony to the Board of Trustees during while the contract was being considered. It was ultimately passed, but the resistance was noted, and we expect it to be taken into account the next time the software comes up for renewal. Yes, please go ahead 2 slides. And then I'm going to skip over this next section. So if you could just go ahead, which is describing free software, please. And one more. Okay. One more, please. So I just want to describe a couple of free software projects at CUNY that I think may be inspiring. First, the CUNY Academic Commons, which is a WordPress-based multi-user interface that is used for teaching and research across the university. Next slide, please. Here is an example of our courses directory. We have many faculty choosing to use this open infrastructure to teach their classes, as opposed to our corporately licensed platform Blackboard. CUNY is among Blackboard's biggest customers. Next slide, please. This is an example of courses being taught on or a listing of courses being taught. Next slide, please. And this is an example of a course group. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. And then just to share one other model, this is a community publishing initiative. It's the Manifold scholarship platform. And this Manifold was primarily conceived of as a platform for university presses, for book publishers to publish digital monographs. But in the CUNY instance, we're using it as a community publishing platform. Next slide, please. And one of the things that you can see, next slide, please, is that it's being used often to publish archival materials, as in this case. Next slide, please. We also have examples of it being used in the classroom as a publication space for CUNY student writing. Next slide, please. For a space for students from multiple classes to collaborate. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. And I'll end in just one moment. Next slide, please. Yes, and just also to say that it is also being used as a space to publish student writing. Okay, if you could now go ahead a couple of more ahead. Okay, one more, please. Okay, so I wanna close here. One back, please. This is a piece published by Jim Groom, who is one of the co-founders of Reclaim Software. And it's a blog post called "I Bleed CUNY Blood." And this was from a talk that Jim gave at CUNY after he had left the system. He had previously been in a program there and had taught at many of the campuses, including the College of Staten Island. And Jim, at this moment, looked out at the landscape of projects like the CUNY Academic Commons and others that were really harnessing a participatory effort, publishing effort across the 25 campuses. CUNY, if you don't know, it's meant to serve the children of the whole people of New York. It's a public university. And Jim said, what if we can bring the power of this open publishing to a space like CUNY? What would it do? And in closing today, I want to suggest that, again, just to reiterate what I said at the beginning, that I think this space of educational technology, the infrastructural platforms on which we conduct our classes and which we and our students publish, should be a prime subject of attention for our work as we do the work of critical infrastructure studies. Thank you so much.